Good morning, and thank you, Carrie. What I would like to discuss right now is another aspect, a very important aspect of developing technology these days, and that has to do with the intellectual property associated with technology development. They go hand in hand, as you have probably been noticing in the news within the industry with respect to intellectual property disputes, very large ones among the big players. So, as you know, design development of new or improved systems or networks takes quite a bit of expertise, as well as resources, whether it's human resources or financial resources. You also need to create alliances and standardization collaborations to make the whole thing take off in an industry. So to really reap the benefits from those design and development efforts that are put in and are tremendous, you really have to create an intellectual property program where you can have competitive IP portfolio development in the first place, where you protect innovation and also think about acquisitions of IP to help you complete a portfolio picture that stands aggressions from your competitors, but also manage the IP portfolio that you have in a sense that that you can tailor the cost associated with the management of the patents that you have according to the strategies that make sense from your competitive perspective, competitive marketplace perspective, and then your own strategies for business that you're pursuing. So doing a competitive analysis and landscaping and figuring out who's doing what, who has what in terms of intellectual property assets, and where you stand, and figuring out what your risks and mitigation of those risks are so that you can address those, and evaluating your own patents in your portfolio and figuring out which ones are worth maintaining, which ones are not, so that you can actually spend your IP dollars wisely.
7 minutes to go.
And at the end, of course, making sure that you are vigilant with any IP infringements on your on the part of your competitors or other parties within the industry, and pursue some sort of patent monetization and IP monetization strategy, whether it's licensing or sales or outright litigation. You've no doubt heard of all the IP race in the 4G era in the early early part of this decade, where on the mobile technology side, at least, some very big players all of a sudden decided that they are really short on their patent and IP portfolio, and in order to survive the industry, they need to be beefing up on that, and among them Apple, Samsung, Google, and of course the traditional players, Qualcomm, Nokia, Ericsson, and all that are big on that front, just as well as the development of the technology front itself. So the patent purchases or acquisitions as a defensive measure became a very big part of their business strategy, and the big players started spending billions of dollars in terms of acquisition of IP that they could use for defensive measures. And there are some examples here that I leave for you to read later. When it comes to patents, there are two types in general: standard essential patents as well as implementation or non-essential patents. There's a definition from Etsy as to what an essential patent means. It's common sense, meaning that it is a patent that without which you cannot implement a product based on that standard. And people, people meaning industry players have long known that the value of a technology that is inserted into a standard. And big players such as Qualcomm and Ericsson spend quite a bit of R&D dollars to not only develop technology that would be suitable for standards contribution, but also to fight to get it into the standards and make sure that it is part of it. When it comes to standard essential patents, there's a concept of fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory practice of licensing those patents out to the industry, because you are your patent or your technology is included in the standard. Anyone who's trying to implement a product based on that standard is forced to use that technology. Therefore, it is always a practice. FRIEND is a practice that predominantly used for that non-discriminatory, fair, and reasonable licensing of patents. SEP, or standard essential patent determination, whether a patent is essential, is not a simple task. Etsy has a database, but that database is self-proclaimed essentiality by the patent owners, so you can imagine that there's a lot of bias associated with that, and it's not very reliable or complete. Keyword searches also leave it unreliable. The really true test of whether a patent is essential is by way of either licensing agreements between parties that prove that both parties on either side have agreed to the essentiality and have agreed to terms and payment terms, licensing terms that are dictated based on that. And then, of course, going to courts and making litigation and making courts decide for you. IEEE has made a dramatic change last year as to what practice, what policy they will practice with respect to standard essential patents. Royalties are no longer calculated based on a percentage of the final product that it included into, but based on the smallest saleable patent practicing unit. And that means if, for example, your technology is included in a chip within a bigger product, the licensing percentage will be based on the price of the chip, not the price of the product, which of course hurts those who are who own the patents, but is favorable to those who want to acquire those licenses. So you can imagine that the people who are in favor are companies like Intel, Cisco, Dell, and HP, and those against are the traditional patent owners like Qualcomm, Nokia, and Ericsson. So the race for IP will not stop. In fact, it will likely be ever more heated up in 5G. There's no reason to imagine that it would be any less heated and any less aggressive than we've seen it so far. And of course, the applications in 5G are tremendous, and technologies associated with those will be likely pursued for essential patents in standards as well as the non-essential ones. Big players in 5G for IP race, as you can see, the top 10 players are there, and 6 of those are Asian companies now, so no longer dominated by US companies. And you'll see that in in activities that are taking place more on the Asian side of the world than over here. So given all that, it's very important to pay attention to the intellectual property assets and how they relate to the technology that you're developing. And to do that, you need to be very careful about assessing your patent portfolios and making the right strategic decisions based on those assessments. So my final slide here, if you were to make assessments of these patents, there are ways to do it. You can do it internally, in-house, if you have the resources, or you can outsource them. And a few comments about how to, what to look for when you're outsourcing the expertise required for such assessments and strategic planning. Obviously, the foremost important thing here is to have the right subject matter experts to do the evaluations, to have engineering resources, if need be, to do the very intensive investigations into the technology itself, whether it's from reverse engineering or otherwise. Having the right management skills to manage the projects, which are usually sometimes very complicated and include multi-subject matters such as legal, business, economic, as well as technology. Having a reputation and referrals to make sure time and quality is addressed correctly, and having comprehensive services.